March 2017, Puget Sound, Naval Shipyard. The plasma torch bit into the steel hull of the decommissioned USS Hampton with a hiss, slicing through metal that had once slipped silently through the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean. For the demolition crew, it was just another Tuesday, another aging Cold War relic being methodically disassembled for scrap. But then the torch reached torpedo tube number 4, listed in the logs as inoperable for over 2 decades. The cutting head met resistance, a thick, crude weld, completely alien to the submarine's meticulous engineering. A second pass, a shower of sparks, and the hatch groaned open, revealing not the expected empty cylinder, but a sealed, man-made tomb. Inside, nestled deep near the outer door, lay the complete skeleton of a man, identified moments later by the dog tags resting on its sternum. Riley, Jack. The discovery was not just the solution to a 22-year-old mystery, it was the beginning of a new one. The inner hatch had been welded shut from the outside. This was not a desertion, not an accident, and not a suicide. At that moment, the official 1995 NCIS file on Petty Officer Second Class Jack Riley, a sailor who had simply vanished from the face of the earth, was reopened. November 1995. Naval Station Norfolk was a city of grey steel and restless energy, the air thick with the smell of salt and diesel. The USS Hampton, a Los Angeles-class submarine, was tied to the pier, a dormant leviathan undergoing routine maintenance. For most of the crew, it was a welcome lull, a chance for shore leave, for phone calls home, for a taste of life on solid ground. For Petty Officer Second Class Jack Riley, it was an opportunity to indulge his quiet, meticulous nature. At 25, he was one of the best sonar technicians on the boat, a man whose job it was to listen, to interpret the whispers of the ocean. It was a skill he applied to his life above the waves as well. Riley was known for being an observer, a man who saw and heard more than he spoke. In his last letter home, he never mentioned any trouble. He wrote about the biting Virginia wind, about saving up for a 1967 Ford Mustang, and promised his younger sister he'd be home for Christmas, no matter what. He'd even tucked an extra $20 into the envelope, telling her to buy something nice. The rumors of gambling debts that would later define his official file seemed utterly disconnected from the man his family knew. Friends from his division would later recall that Riley didn't gamble. He lent money, often to the same sailors who would later whisper about his supposed vices. His last phone call was to his mother. He sounded tired but content. He told her he was fine, that work was demanding but rewarding, and that he loved her. There was no hint of fear in his voice, no sign of a man about to abandon his life, his career, and his family. He was a dedicated sailor, a man who had found his place in the structured, demanding world of the silent service. On the evening of his disappearance, Riley completed his watch and signed the log. He spoke briefly with a fellow petty officer, mentioning a faint anomaly he'd picked up on a sonar diagnostic earlier that day. He said he was going back down to the forward compartment near the torpedo room to run a check on the equipment. He wanted to make sure everything was perfect before their next deployment. It was a typically meticulous move from a man who left nothing to chance. He was last seen walking toward the forward hatch, a small toolkit in his hand. He was expected to be in his bunk by 2200, ready for the next day's duties. But he never arrived. The following morning, at the 0800 muster, his name was called out into the crisp autumn air. Petty Officer Riley. Silence. Riley. The empty space where he should have been standing felt impossibly vast. A third and final call, met only by the cry of gulls and the low hum of the pier. His bunk was found untouched. His wallet, his keys, and his plans for the future were all there. But Jack Riley was gone. The shipyard, a place of loud industrial deconstruction, became a site of hushed, sterile procedure. The demolition crew was replaced by a joint team from the Norfolk Police Department's Cold Case Unit and the NCIS. Leading the civilian side was Detective Marty Hogan, a former Navy man whose quiet demeanor hid a deep-seated intolerance for loose ends. He moved through the cavernous hull of the Hampton with a grim familiarity, the stale, recycled air a ghost of his own past. This was his world, but he had never seen it like this. The crime scene was a 21-inch diameter cylinder of cold, unforgiving steel, designed to expel a 5,300-pound weapon with a blast of compressed air. Now, it was a coffin. Forensic specialists worked in the cramped, claustrophobic space, their movements precise, their voices low. The skeleton was found at the far end, near the muzzle, lying face up, as if placed there with some final morbid consideration. Every particle of dust, every fleck of rust was collected, bagged, and labeled. The focus quickly turned to the inner hatch. The weld was brutal, ugly, and utterly out of place amidst the submarine's sophisticated engineering. Metallurgists confirmed it was not a standard shipyard repair. The bead was uneven, the application hurried. It was a seal, not a fix. The first critical question hung in the air, heavy as lead. Who on a secure naval vessel has access to welding equipment and the opportunity to use it unnoticed to seal a man inside a torpedo tube? Preliminary examination of the remains by the forensic anthropologist on site yielded the second question. There were no obvious signs of ballistic or blade trauma. The bones were intact, but there was a minute hairline fracture on the hyoid bone, a delicate C-shaped structure in the neck that supports the tongue. It was a detail easily missed, a subtle mark that suggested a different, more personal kind of violence. A death that was quiet and close. Among the skeletal remains, 2 artifacts were recovered. The first were the dog tags, their stamped letters providing an immediate and undeniable identity. The second was a Zippo lighter, heavily corroded, its case fused shut by 22 years of slow decay in the humid, sealed environment. It was a solid lump of brass and corrosion, a small personal effect that felt tragically out of place in this cold, mechanical tomb. The picture that emerged within the first 48 hours was chilling. Getting a body into the torpedo room would require bypassing multiple checkpoints and security patrols. Welding the hatch shut would require time, power, and a deliberate disregard for the noise it would create. This was not a panicked crime of passion. It was not a fight that went too far. This was an execution, a calculated act of erasure. The meticulous planning required to conceal a body in one of the most inaccessible places on a nuclear submarine spoke of a level of audacity and authority that was staggering. Jack Riley hadn't just been killed. He had been interred, his grave sealed with an industrial finality. The investigation wasn't just looking for a killer. It was looking for someone who commanded the shadows of a warship. In 2017, Detective Hogan sat in a sterile archive room, the original 1995 NCIS case file on Jack Riley spread open before him. It was a thin folder, its contents a testament not to a thorough investigation, but to a hasty conclusion. The first 48 hours of the original search had been by the book. Divers checked the murky waters of the pier, security logs were reviewed, and crew members were questioned. But the file's tone shifted dramatically on page 3 after the formal interviews with the submarine's command leadership. Captain Marcus Jones, a man already marked for flag rank, had provided a statement that was both damning and decisive. He spoke of rumors concerning Petty Officer Riley's financial troubles, of a change in attitude he'd personally observed. He painted a picture of a young man cracking under pressure, a potential security risk. The ship's weapons officer, Lieutenant Commander Frank Evans, and the chief of the boat, Master Chief David Thorne, echoed their captain's assessment in their own interviews, their statements almost perfectly aligned. The narrative was set. Riley wasn't a victim. He was a liability who had fled his responsibilities. The investigation pivoted. Instead of a search for a missing person, it became a manhunt for a deserter. Questions about who saw Riley last were replaced with questions about who he owed money to. The faint sonar anomaly he'd mentioned was dismissed as irrelevant. The focus narrowed with an almost surgical precision, excising any possibility other than desertion. The powerful, unified voice of the Hampton's command structure effectively steered the entire investigation away from the submarine itself. Riley's family had fought this narrative fiercely. They provided letters, bank statements, and character references that contradicted the official story. His mother wrote a desperate 6-page letter to the commanding officer of the naval base, pleading with him to look deeper, to consider that her son, a boy who loved the Navy more than anything, would never just walk away. The letter received a form reply, a single paragraph expressing regret and citing the ongoing investigation. It was a bureaucratic wall, as cold and impenetrable as the hull of the Hampton. Within 3 months, the case was officially closed. Jack Riley was declared a deserter, a warrant was issued for his arrest, and a black mark was placed upon a service record that had, until that point, been exemplary. The file was stamped, signed, and buried in an archive. Reading it decades later, Hogan understood that the original investigators hadn't failed due to incompetence. They had failed because they were confronted by a wall of silence, built and reinforced by the very men entrusted with the crew's welfare. It was a silence born not of ignorance, but of a carefully guarded, lethal secret. Detective Hogan began the slow, arduous process of reassembling the crew of the USS Hampton, a crew scattered by 2 decades of civilian life. He found them in suburbs, in factories, and in retirement communities, men whose sharp military bearings had softened with time. Their memories of 1995 were a haze of deployments and port calls, but the name Jack Riley acted as a key, unlocking a specific, disquieting chapter. They remembered him as quiet, smart, a good sailor. They also remembered the official story. They had believed it. Most still did. When Hogan mentioned Captain Marcus Jones, a palpable shift occurred in the interviews. Men who had been forthcoming would suddenly grow guarded. Their answers became shorter, their eye contact fleeting. Jones was remembered not with warmth, but with a mixture of fear and awe. He was a commander who demanded perfection and tolerated no dissent. The old man got what he wanted, always, one former petty officer said, his voice dropping low, as if Jones himself might overhear. This was the ghost Hogan was truly chasing. Not just the memory of Jack Riley, but the long shadow of his captain. A few remembered more. One former torpedoman, now a high school physics teacher in Ohio, recalled the days after Riley vanished. The entire forward compartment, specifically the torpedo room, had been declared off-limits for what was called unscheduled critical maintenance. It was unusual during a resupply period, but no one questioned an order from the chief of the boat, David Thorne, especially when it came with the captain's authority. The man couldn't recall the exact dates, but he remembered the feeling on the boat, a tense, unspoken command to mind your own business. While Hogan chased fading memories, his team at the NCIS archives in Quantico hunted for facts. Memory is a notoriously unreliable witness. Paper, however, does not forget. They cross-referenced duty rosters with personnel files, building a digital ghost of the submarine's crew. A pattern began to emerge. In the 6 months following Riley's disappearance, 5 sailors assigned to the Forward Weapons Division were transferred, not in a group, but one by one, to different commands, different oceans. A quiet, systematic dispersal of potential witnesses. The focus then narrowed to the submarine's maintenance and supply logs. Hogan wanted to know everything about torpedo tube number 4. The official record, signed in early 1996 by Lieutenant Commander Evans, stated the tube was taken offline due to a catastrophic hydraulic failure. The paperwork seemed to be in perfect order. Requisition forms detailed the purchase of new hydraulic pumps, seals, and several drums of specialized fluid for the repair. It was a complete, logical, and thoroughly documented fiction. And then a junior analyst found it. Buried deep within a stack of supply chain invoices from the Norfolk Naval Yard, stapled to the back of the work order for the hydraulic parts, was a supplemental requisition. It was a small order, easily overlooked, for a material that had absolutely no function in the repair of a torpedo tube's hydraulic system. It was an order signed by Evans for 4 canisters of military-grade acoustic sound dampening foam, the kind used to insulate compartments and absorb vibrations. There were no other maintenance orders for insulation work on the Hampton during that entire period. The original 1995 NCIS file was built on a single powerful pillar: Jack Riley's supposed gambling debts. It was a narrative championed by Captain Jones himself, and Detective Hogan, now certain it was a lie, decided to treat it not as a motive for desertion, but as a motive for murder. If Riley was in debt, perhaps a confrontation with a creditor had turned violent. It was a classic, albeit grim, line of inquiry. Hogan's team began digging into the financial lives of the Hampton's crew, looking for anyone Riley might have owed money to, or more likely, anyone who owed him. The search led them to a name: Leo Miller, a former petty officer who had been discharged from the Navy a year after Riley's disappearance for disorderly conduct. Interviews with other crewmen painted a picture of a man with a short fuse and a chronic shortage of cash. 2 separate witnesses recalled a heated argument between Miller and Riley on the pier just days before he vanished. The subject was money. Miller owed Riley $300, a significant sum for a junior enlisted sailor at the time. The theory began to solidify. Hogan's team uncovered Miller's sealed juvenile record, a charge of aggravated assault from when he was 17. The pieces seemed to fall into place with a sickening click. A man with a history of violence, a public dispute over money, and a victim who disappears days later. It was a textbook homicide case. For several weeks, the entire focus of the investigation narrowed onto Leo Miller. They tracked him down to a trailer park outside of Biloxi, Mississippi, where he worked as a mechanic. He was a man worn down by life, his past anger seemingly replaced by a tired resignation. Hogan confronted him not as a witness, but as the prime suspect. He laid out the timeline, the motive, the argument on the pier. Miller denied it all with a weary shake of his head. He admitted he'd argued with Riley, admitted he'd owed him money, but swore he'd had nothing to do with his disappearance. It was a denial Hogan had heard 100 times before. But Miller had something else. He had proof. He directed them to his mother, who produced a small, worn photo album. In it were pictures of a family reunion in rural Pennsylvania, dated the same week Riley vanished. More importantly, the Navy's own archives held the irrefutable truth. A cross-check of the Hampton's muster logs against base leave records produced a signed leave chit. On the day Jack Riley disappeared, Leo Miller was on approved leave, 300 miles away, a fact corroborated by gas station receipts and the testimony of a dozen family members. The alibi was absolute. The theory didn't just weaken, it evaporated. Hogan was back at square one, but the dead end was not a total loss. It revealed a crucial truth. The story about gambling debts wasn't just a mistaken assumption. It was a deliberate piece of misinformation, a false scent expertly laid in 1995 to send any investigation chasing a ghost. Someone hadn't just killed Jack Riley. They had immediately started building a fortress of lies around his memory. The investigation had reached a quiet impasse. Witnesses were a dead end, and the false trail had cost them valuable time. The case file was filled with circumstantial evidence, a constellation of suspicious facts that pointed to a conspiracy but named no one. On Detective Hogan's desk sat the evidence bags from the torpedo tube. Among them was the corroded Zippo lighter, a solid, useless lump of metal. It was a personal effect, nothing more. But Hogan, guided by an instinct honed over 30 years of police work, felt a nagging refusal to dismiss it. On a hunch, a final act of due diligence, He sent the lighter not to a metallurgist, but to the NCIS Forensic Analysis Unit at Quantico with a simple request: non-destructive imaging. See what's inside. Weeks passed. Then a call came. The lab had used a high-resolution neutron imaging scanner, a device capable of differentiating between materials at a microscopic level. The first scans showed the corroded inner workings, the flint wheel fused to its housing. But nestled deep inside the cotton wadding, miraculously shielded from the worst of the decay, was a small, dense anomaly. It was a tiny piece of paper, folded until it was no bigger than a sugar cube, and saturated with lighter fluid which had, paradoxically, acted as a preservative against moisture. The lab technicians opened the lighter with the precision of watchmakers. The paper was a fragile, tissue-thin relic. Under specialized lights, using imaging software that enhanced faded ink, they painstakingly unfurled the message. It was a short note, written in the neat block lettering of a technician. The first part was a series of alphanumeric codes, a string of numbers and letters that meant nothing to the analysts. When the digital image was sent to Hogan, he stared at it for a full minute. Then, a cold recognition washed over him. He had spent the first 10 years of his career in naval logistics. These weren't random characters. He knew this syntax. They were part numbers. Specifically, they were part numbers for proprietary microprocessors and guidance system components used in Tomahawk cruise missiles, parts that had absolutely no business being on the official cargo manifest of the USS Hampton in 1995. Then he read the last line, a phrase scrawled in a more hurried, urgent hand, as if written in the final moments of understanding. Jones and Evans, Tube 4. My God. It was the key, the Rosetta Stone of the entire case. Suddenly, every disparate clue snapped into a single, horrifying mosaic. The specialized welding rod ordered by Weapons Officer Evans, the torpedo room being placed off-limits for maintenance, the systematic transfer of the entire forward weapons division. The acoustic sound-dampening foam wasn't to fix a piece of equipment. It was to muffle the screams and the sounds of welding. The carefully constructed lie about gambling debts was the first act of the cover-up, a ghost story created by Captain Jones to haunt his victim's memory and lead investigators away from the truth. This wasn't a murder over a $300 debt. This was an execution to protect a multi-million-dollar smuggling ring run by the ship's commanding officer. Jack Riley hadn't stumbled into a fight. He had stumbled upon an empire. Based on Master Chief Thorne's confession and the irrefutable evidence from the lighter, the final hours of Jack Riley's life came into sharp, tragic focus. He had not been hunting for a fault in the sonar system. The anomaly he mentioned was a lie, a cover for his real intentions. He had overheard something, a whispered conversation, seen a crate where no crate should be. Driven by a sailor's sense of duty, he went to the torpedo room that night to confirm a suspicion he could barely bring himself to believe. There, in the low yellow light of the forward compartment, he found them. Captain Marcus Jones and his weapons officer, Frank Evans, standing over several open, unmarked crates. Inside was not standard naval ordnance, but the delicate, high-tech viscera of missile guidance systems. Riley saw the truth in an instant. His captain, the man whose authority was absolute, was engaged in high treason. He was caught seeing it. There was a moment of frozen silence, the hum of the ship's machinery the only sound. In that moment, Riley must have known he would not be leaving this compartment. As they moved to corner him, he turned his back for a fraction of a second, his hand going to the Zippo in his pocket. With a presence of mind that is almost unimaginable, he slipped the tiny folded note inside, a final desperate message in a bottle cast into an ocean of time. The confrontation was brief. Master Chief Thorne was summoned, his loyalty to his captain overriding his duty to his shipmate. There was a desperate, muffled struggle in the narrow walkway between the torpedo racks. It ended not with a loud cry, but with a sickening finality. Riley's small toolkit clattered to the steel deck plates, the sound echoing in the sudden, absolute stillness. The forensic report would later note the hairline fracture on his hyoid bone, the silent, anatomical signature of a man whose breath had been stolen from him by overwhelming force. His death was quiet, efficient, and final. He was a loose end, and Captain Jones was a man who tied off his loose ends with ruthless precision. What followed was a cold, procedural act of concealment. They opened the inner hatch of Tube 4, the one already scheduled for a fictitious hydraulic repair. Lifting Riley's lifeless form, they slid him into the cold, dark cylinder, pushing him deep toward the outer muzzle door. His dog tags made a faint metallic sound against the steel. Then they began the work of sealing him in. Thorne stood guard while Evans, using the acoustic foam he had specially ordered, packed the gaps around the hatch to deaden the noise. Evans, the man who had signed the requisition for the specialized welding rod, then went to work. The bright, angry hiss of the welder's torch filled the torpedo room, its glare throwing monstrous shadows against the bulkheads. The acrid smell of burning metal and ozone filled the air as he laid a thick, ugly bead of molten steel over the seam, a permanent, industrial scar on the submarine's skin. Jack Riley's world was reduced to a 21-inch cylinder of absolute darkness, his tomb sealed not just with steel, but with the full and terrible weight of his captain's authority. Armed with Master Chief Thorne's full confession, the wheels of justice began to turn, grinding forward after 22 years of silence. Thorne himself, a man broken by decades of guilt, cooperated fully, accepting a plea deal that would see him spend his remaining years in a federal medical facility. His testimony was the final, living proof that corroborated the story told by a piece of paper and a crude weld. The case against the man at the top of the pyramid was now ironclad. The arrest of retired Rear Admiral Marcus Jones was executed with a quiet, devastating precision. It did not happen at his home or his office, but at a high-profile charity gala in Washington, D.C., an event where he was being honored for his contributions to national defense. As cameras flashed and applause echoed through the grand ballroom, Detective Hogan, accompanied by 2 NCIS agents, approached Jones at his table. They spoke in low tones, presenting the warrant. The Admiral's initial reaction was one of arrogant disbelief, a cold fury directed at the audacity of these men. He maintained this facade until Hogan placed a small, clear evidence bag on the white tablecloth. Inside was the Zippo, and beside it, a high-resolution photograph of the note it had contained. Jones stared at the words, Jones and Evans, Tube 4. My God. The blood drained from his face. The rigid military posture he had held for a lifetime dissolved. He collapsed back into his chair, a silent, broken man. The trial was a media sensation, a story of honor corrupted at the highest levels of the military. The section of torpedo tube number 4 was brought into the courtroom, a monstrous, silent witness. Prosecutors methodically laid out the case, the smuggling ring, the murder, and the 22-year cover-up. Jones's defense attorneys attempted to portray him as a patriot and Master Chief Thorne as a senile, unreliable witness. But the note from the lighter, Jack Riley's final desperate testimony, was irrefutable. It was the voice from the grave that condemned him. The verdict was swift, guilty on all counts. Murder, conspiracy, and multiple violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Marcus Jones was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, stripped of his rank, his pension, and his honor. In the courtroom gallery, Jack Riley's elderly mother and sister wept silently, clutching a faded photograph of a smiling young man in a sailor's uniform. His sister later told reporters, "It's not closure. That will never come. But it's truth. After all this time, the truth is out, and we finally have our brother back." As for Lieutenant Commander Frank Evans, the man who welded the hatch shut, no earthly justice could be served. He had died in a single-car accident on a deserted highway in 2002. The incident had been ruled an accident at the time. In light of the new revelations, it was a ruling that no one, especially not Detective Hogan, believed anymore. Justice had been served, but it was an incomplete and imperfect victory, a final accounting decades too late. Today, the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard continues its work, a place of constant, controlled disassembly and rebirth. The USS Hampton is gone, its steel hull broken down, melted, and recycled into 1,000 anonymous things. All that remains of the vessel itself is a single 10-foot section of torpedo tube preserved under seal in an NCIS evidence locker in Quantico, a grotesque artifact of a crime that logic dictated should have been impossible. The space at the pier where the submarine spent its final days is now empty, a vacant stretch of water and concrete indistinguishable from any other. The official records were corrected. Petty Officer Second Class Jack Riley is no longer listed as a deserter. His status was posthumously amended to killed in the line of duty, and the nation he served finally acknowledged his sacrifice. His family was presented with a folded flag, a symbol of honor restored 22 years too late. Conversely, the name of Rear Admiral Marcus Jones was systematically erased. His portraits were removed from the hallowed halls of the Naval War College, his name stricken from plaques, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale of hubris and treason. The case of the USS Hampton became a quiet legend within the Navy, a grim study in how the absolute power of command can be twisted into a tool for personal gain. It exposed the terrifying reality that the very secrecy and discipline that make the submarine force so effective can also be used to conceal the darkest of sins. The Silent Service, an institution built on trust and the unspoken bond between shipmates, was forced to confront a betrayal that came from the very top of its own chain of command. One young man, a quiet listener, armed with only his integrity and a small piece of paper, ultimately brought down an empire built on greed. His actions serve as a stark reminder that true courage is not always found in the heat of battle, but sometimes in the lonely, quiet act of bearing witness. The system failed him, his commanders murdered him, and the official story buried him under a mountain of lies. But the truth, much like an object in deep water, possesses a stubborn buoyancy. The pier where the Hampton was dismantled is now silent, save for the cry of gulls and the whisper of the wind off the water. But it is a different kind of silence than the one that once shrouded the submarine. It is no longer the silence of conspiracy or of a secret kept under immense pressure. It is the silence of a question finally answered. The silence that proves that no tomb is deep enough and nothing stays submerged forever.